Okay, everyone, welcome to the second day of the American Studies Festival. I'm Jørgen Brøndal, and I chair the Center for American Studies here at SDU. Today, we're starting out with the Honora Rankine-Galloway Address that since its initial launch in 2000 has become an institution with us. In just a few seconds, Vicky Bodnar will be introducing Dr. Shelley Fishkin of Stanford University, who more than anyone else in this world personifies the transnational turn in American studies. Then we'll have a talk by Dr. James Fishkin, likewise of Stanford, who more than anyone else in the world personifies the concept of deliberative polling, and by the way, who was here in 2007 and did polling here. Later today, we'll have an exciting talk by another brilliant academic, Dr. Gina Kaysen of Georgia State University, and we'll round the day and the festival off with talks by some of our bravest and most talented students. And we'll have the American Studies Student Award ceremony that Public Diplomacy Officer Philip Assis of the U.S. Embassy will be presiding over. Thank you so much to the U.S. Embassy and to SDU for sponsoring this event. Two practical notes. In the program, there's a QR code, one for Thursday, one for Friday. Please scan the code and rate the events. Also, Dr. Fishkin is the co-founder of the Journal of Transnational American Studies. She urges graduate students and members of the faculty to consider contributing to an upcoming issue of the journal with short essays, max 1,500 words, that constitute reflections on the US 2024 elections in a global context. Now I'll leave the floor to Vicky, who will introduce our first speaker today.
Hello, everyone. It is my great pleasure to introduce today's distinguished speaker, Dr. Shelley Fishkin. Dr. Fishkin is a renowned scholar whose career has been defined by a commitment to literature and social justice, particularly through the exploration of race, racism, and the recovery of silenced voices in American history. Her body of work spans a wide range of topics from American literature and African American studies to feminist criticism and the role of literature in social change. Perhaps more than any other scholar in her field, Dr. Fishkin has pioneered the transnational turn in American studies. In 2009, she co-founded the Journal of Transnational American Studies, and recently in 2019, the American Studies Association created the Shelley Fishkin Prize for International Scholarship in Transnational American Studies. Dr. Fishkin is the author, editor, and co-editor of 48 books, including the acclaimed Writing America: Literary Landmarks from Walden Pond to Wounded Knee. As one of the world's leading experts in Mark Twain, much of her work is focused on this given topic, as well as her new upcoming monograph, Jim, The Life and Afterlives of Huckleberry Finn's Comrade. She has also edited the monumental Oxford Mark Twain series and played a key role in bringing Twain's forgotten play, Is He Dead?, to Broadway, where it was nominated for a Tony Award. In addition to her impressive scholarly achievements, Dr. Fishkin has been recognized with numerous prestigious awards, including the Carl Bode Norman Holmes Pearson Prize for a Lifetime Achievement and Outstanding Contribution to American Studies Award. She has also been a Fulbright Distinguished Lecturer and a Fellow at various international universities. Currently, Dr. Fishkin is the Joseph S. Atha Professor of Humanities and a Professor of English at Stanford University, where she serves as the Director of American Studies. She is also the co-founder of the Chinese Railroad Workers in North America Project, a groundbreaking initiative that seeks to recover the history of Chinese laborers who helped build the transnational railroads. Today, she is here to give the annual Honora Rankine-Galloway Address, a lecture series which was established in 2000 at the Center of American Studies in honor of Honora Rankine-Galloway, a former cultural attaché of the U.S. Embassy in Copenhagen, who unfortunately passed away due to cancer at the age of 51, although she is fondly remembered as throughout her life she had enthusiastically promoted and helped organize several events in collaboration with American Studies. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Shelley Fishkin, whose work has not only advanced research, but has also made a lasting impact on the way we understand American culture and history. We are honored to have her with us today. Dr. Fishkin, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Vicky. I really appreciate that lovely and generous introduction. Thank you to Jørgen Brøndal for inviting me here, and to the Embassy for supporting our visits. It's a real pleasure to be here. Teaching America's past and present in all its complexity has never been an easy task. But the project itself is increasingly under attack today in America's schools. During the last few years, under pressure from right-wing politicians, more than half of US states have passed measures designed to discourage teachers from teaching their students about the role that racism has played in America's past and present. Laws commonly referred to as critical race theory bans have been passed recently in many states with Republican-led legislatures. Their goal is to prevent teachers from discussing the history of American racism in America's classrooms. Is there a problem with the mic?
What's making that sound? Keep going.
Okay.
Great
Just-
SDU.
Shall I continue?
I think you should.
Okay. The laws have been prompting some idealistic aspiring teachers who care about teaching accurate versions of America's past to reconsider their decision to go into teaching in the first place. An organization called Citizens Renewing America, run by Trump's former budget director, issued a toolkit for combating critical race theory in your community. It states that social justice scholars think anti-racism is, quote, a lifelong commitment to an ongoing process of fighting systemic racism, requiring people to constantly reflect upon the ways in which we are all complicit in racism, end quote. Well, that commitment sounds pretty good to me. Indeed, it describes much of what I've spent my professional life trying to fulfill. But to the writers of this toolkit, that commitment is reprehensible. In October, the host of Fox and Friends, a show on the Fox TV network, asked Donald Trump what he would do about schools teaching students about slavery and the country's history of discrimination. They used a generic school in San Diego as an example. Trump claimed he would withhold federal funding. Laws have recently been passed in more than half the states in the US, banning the teaching of what I view as an accurate version of the nation's history. I've long believed that art can illuminate the truths that politicians who pass these laws prefer to bury, if we let it. Today, I'll suggest that teaching Adventures of Huckleberry Finn has the potential to let teachers do an end run around the right-wing ban on a topic they're forbidden to address on its own, the role of racism in America's past. Recognized as a cornerstone of America's literary heritage, the celebrated canonical novel written by a very dead, very white author is, in short, a book that can be a Trojan horse, enabling us to open our classrooms to issues these politicians don't want discussed. Teaching this iconic text responsibly requires that we bring the history of America's racism into our classroom. Making sense of the novel compels us to understand Jim's condition as an enslaved person in antebellum Missouri. It demands that we examine the ways in which interlocking institutions in the society, from the church to the law to the scientific establishment, conspire to reinforce the racism that underpinned that condition. Our efforts to examine that de facto conspiracy terrifies the right, since it shines a light on the broad contours of institutional racism that they're determined to bury or deny. But it is central to the world Twain portrays in the novel, and it's key to understanding the book. St. Petersburg, Missouri, the setting of the novel, is modeled on the town in which Mark Twain grew up, Hannibal, Missouri. Unlike slaveholding on the large cotton, rice, and sugar plantations of the Deep South, slaveholding in Missouri was small scale, with most households owning or renting a handful of slaves to raise wheat, corn, barley, rye, flax, oats, hemp, and fruit, to tend hogs and cows, mind children, do carpentry, cooking, cleaning, washing, gardening, and ironing. Jim's principal duty is minding the cattle. As an enslaved man in antebellum Missouri, Jim has the same rights as his mistress's cows and chickens. As Twain notes in his autobiography, in his youth, quote, the local pulpit taught us that God approved of slavery, that it was a holy thing, and that its doubters only need look in the Bible if he wished to settle his mind. And then the texts were read aloud to make the matter sure, end quote. It was a world in which enslaved people were prohibited from learning to read or write, and therefore couldn't find out for themselves that there were verses in the Bible other than, servants, obey thy masters. Students can't understand why Jim and other slaves don't simply cross the river and seek refuge in the free state of Illinois without understanding how both the culture and the law made that choice treacherous. Runaways were severely punished, and anyone who helped slaves try to escape risked being sentenced to the state penitentiary. The large rewards for capturing a runaway Missouri slave outside the state, the equivalent of thousands of dollars today, helped make the Illinois shore a risky destination for runaways and helps explain why Jim does not seek refuge there. The precarity of Jim's situation and his hesitation about speaking his mind, even to a child, when that child was white, becomes clearer to students when they are told that in this world, a slave could receive up to 39 lashes just for directing insulting language to a white person. When Huck callously toys with Jim's very real grief after the two are separated during the fog, Jim's decision to shame and rebuke Huck by calling him trash is all the more remarkable, given the penalties that existed for insulting a white person. An enslaved person's mobility, social interactions, speech, and deportment were greatly constrained in many other ways as well. Jim is determined to save himself and those he loves from the potential harm, from the potential terrors that fate might hold for them. His principal goal in life, that which drives everything that he does from the moment he realizes that Miss Watson is planning to sell him, is to seek his own freedom and that of his family. Enslaved people lived with the awful knowledge that someone they loved could be taken from them suddenly at any time, as testimony gathered from Missouri slaves, which is readily available on the Library of Congress website online, makes clear. Mary Armstrong recalls, for example, that her owner whipped her 9-month-old sister just because she cried, as all babies do, killing her in the process. And these are slaves from Hannibal. Emma Knight's father was put on the block and sold because the master wanted money to buy something for the house. When Twain himself was 10, he watched a white man strike and kill a slave with a piece of iron on one of Hannibal's main streets. Even enslaved people owned by so-called good masters could be sold away from their families. John Quarles, Sam Clemens' favorite uncle, and by all reports a kindly master, gave the son of Daniel Quarles, a slave he had known from birth, to his son as a gift. John Quarles' son Ben sold Daniel Quarles' son Harvey for a piece of land. Daniel Quarles, who would be a model for Jim and Huckleberry Finn, never saw his son again. Wanton cruelty was frowned upon and nominally prohibited by law, but it was common nonetheless. Jim's steely determination to buy or steal his wife and children out of slavery comes from living in this precarious world. Twain wrote that he vividly remembered, quote, seeing a dozen black men and women chained to one another once, lying in a group on the pavement, awaiting shipment to the southern slave market. Those were the saddest faces I have ever seen, end quote. In those old slaveholding days, Clemens recalled, quote, the whole community was agreed as to one thing, the awful sacredness of slave property. To help steal a horse or a cow was a low crime, but to help a hunted slave or feed him or shelter him or hide him or comfort him in his troubles, his terrors, his despair, or hesitate to promptly betray him to the slave catcher when opportunity offered was a much baser crime and carried with it a stain, a moral smirch which nothing could wipe away, end quote. It's important to understand what transpired in Missouri after the 13th Amendment ended slavery following the Civil War in 1865 if we are to appreciate what happens in the last portion of the novel. As Kidada Williams documents in her new book, I Saw Death Coming, A History of Terror and Survival in the War Against Reconstruction, Reconstruction was a time when formerly enslaved people were regularly terrorized by white supremacists. These forces would become more brazen after the election of 1876. The Tide election and the Compromise of 1877 that followed, that was required to have a president at all, resulted in effect in the removal of the federal troops that had been safeguarding the rights of the former slaves in the South. It ushered in a near total retreat from civil rights and a restoration of power to the former Confederates. Historians now recognize this period as a time in which conditions akin to slavery were reestablished through sharecropping, lynchings, the convict lease system, and various forms of violent intimidation, including arson and murder, that effectively prevented Black people from exercising rights they had been granted by law. As W.E.B. Du Bois would put it, the slave went free, stood a brief moment in the sun, then moved back again towards slavery, end quote. This, of course, is exactly what happens to Jim in the novel. The last third of the book is increasingly recognized today as Twain's satire of how the nation botched the enterprise of freeing slaves. The powers that be today in Tennessee, Alabama, Florida, and dozens of other states do not want students to learn about the shameful history of slavery and the ways in which the nation eroded the rights that had been granted to the formerly enslaved after the war. But Twain's novel embodies and illuminates that history in fresh and powerful ways, perhaps as only a work of art can. Teaching this classic novel responsibly demands that teachers bring this history into their classrooms. The right-wing forces that have banned the teaching of history that might make some students feel bad about themselves are not about to ban an iconic work of fiction by a celebrated white male author. But while Huckleberry Finn may not be challenged from the right, it faces censorship from the left, from well-meaning individuals who identify as progressive, who misread it as bolstering the racism that it attacks. Excuse me. Since the late 1950s, Huck Finn has been frequently banished from American classrooms. And in fact, if I had not moved from New York to Connecticut before high school, I would never have read the book in school myself. Although its repeated use of an offensive racial slur often figures in these bans, an issue I'm happy to address in the question period, the characterization of Jim is often just as central. In 1994, Texas State Senator Royce West introduced a bill that would have prevented any state funds from being spent on Huckleberry Finn. He told me that parents didn't view Jim as a positive role model for their children when I interviewed him. In 2019, 2 New Jersey legislators instituted a resolution to prevent the book from being taught in the state out of concern that it, quote, can cause students to feel upset, marginalized, or humiliated, end quote. Jim's presence in American classrooms has been challenged in Arizona, California, Connecticut, I need a deep breath here, Florida, Iowa, Illinois, Iowa, Kansas, Maryland, Massachusetts, Michigan, Minnesota, Mississippi, New Jersey, New York, Oklahoma, Oregon, Pennsylvania, Texas, Virginia, Washington, and elsewhere. The parents and others behind these challenges argue that the book promulgates racist stereotypes rather than undermining them. They charge that Jim is a character drawn from minstrelsy, and claim that he is presented in a manner that demeans, diminishes, and denigrates him, that presents him as a proper object of ridicule. But is Jim drawn from minstrelsy? Does Twain present him as an object of ridicule? Challenging this canard turns out to be more important today than ever before. As Eric Lott has shown, blackface minstrel shows were theatrical practice that embodied a contradictory blend of love and theft from Black culture by white working-class Americans. Born in the 1830s, these shows became the most popular form of entertainment in 19th century America. They featured short burlesque skits, sentimental songs, and raucous dancing. The actors were usually white men, their faces blacked with burned cork, portraying ludicrous blacks who were bumptious and boastful, fatuous fools who deserved to be objects of derision, but who were also able to make fun of the upper classes in ways that working-class audiences found appealing. The Black characters who appeared in the minstrel shows Mark Twain saw in Hannibal, St. Louis, New York, San Francisco, and elsewhere were variously stupid, proud, gullible, ignorant, confident, passive, lazy, and impervious to pain. Most were undergirded by the pretense, most shows were undergirded by the pretense that slavery was right and natural. These shows helped white Americans deny the brutality of slavery after slavery's end, and help them ignore the continuing injustices and indignities imposed on Black Americans. Twain himself had fond memories of minstrel shows he had seen. But what does this have to do with Jim? The argument that Jim's character is based on racial stereotypes goes like this. Minstrel shows demeaned Black people. Mark Twain liked minstrel shows. Therefore, Mark Twain crafted Jim in the demeaning image of the Negro of the minstrel stage. Many critics since the 1950s have claimed to identify echoes of minstrel show dialogues, minstrel show humor, and minstrel show language in episodes involving Jim and Huck Finn. But we have to remember that Twain recognized that what minstrel shows presented had little to do with reality. As he wrote in 1873, 3 years before he began writing Huck Finn, quote, "The so-called Negro minstrels simply misrepresent the thing. I do not think they ever saw a plantation," end quote. Although Twain enjoyed minstrel shows, he viewed them as fundamentally artificial concoctions created as a stylized form of entertainment. If the so-called Negroes simply misrepresent the world of antebellum slavery, as Twain says they did, why would Twain draw on these artificial concoctions when he had a plethora of authentic real-life models on which he could draw? The many smart, strong, creative, and admirable Black individuals Twain got to know personally allowed him to reject the dominant racial myths that Black people were not intelligent or creative and that they did not feel pain the way white people did. These myths were first voiced by Thomas Jefferson and were later endorsed by the so-called scientific establishment throughout the 19th century and beyond. Let me just mention briefly 8 individuals who showed Twain that these myths bore no relation to reality. Each of them played a role in his creation of Jim. The myth that Black people were stupid was blasted out of the water for Twain by the erudite guide he met in Venice during his first European tour. Throughout the trip, Twain voiced a steady patter of complaints about the stupidity, arrogance, and irritating manner of all the tour guides he met, but one. In Venice, he met a guide who was the child of South Carolina slaves, who knew his art history cold, was bursting with learned insights into Venice's painting, architecture, and history. His enslaved parents had come to Venice when he was an infant. Twain wrote that, quote, he is well educated. He reads, writes, and speaks English, Italian, Spanish, and French with perfect facility. He is a worshiper of art and thoroughly conversant with it, knows the history of Venice by heart, and never tires of talking about her illustrious career. He dresses better than any of us, I think. Negroes are deemed as good as white people in Venice, and so this man feels no desire to go back to his native land. His judgment is correct, end quote. One would be hard-pressed to find as admiring a description of any Black person by any writer at this time. And he wrote this in Innocents Abroad, his first travel book. The Black guide in Venice is not as good as any of the white guides Twain has encountered on the trip. He is vastly superior to them. His very existence made the stupidity myth dissolve into thin air. The myth of Black stupidity was also challenged for Twain by his friendship with a man possessing one of the greatest minds of the century, the eloquent Frederick Douglass, whom Twain met through his father-in-law, who had helped Douglass escape slavery. And it was challenged as well by his friendship with George Griffin, an astute man who worked as the butler in Twain's home in Hartford, but was also his sounding board, billiard companion, and literary advisor. Griffin shrewdly would gather information from Twain's well-placed political friends that enabled him to turn political bets he collected in the Black community into a tidy nest egg. In addition, there was Twain's friendship with a man named John Lewis, a tenant farmer in upstate New York, where Twain and his family spent summers. Lewis's quick thinking helped him save members of Twain's family from certain death when he managed against all odds to stop a runaway horse about to crash the carriage in which they were riding. And I'd love to tell you more about George Griffin and John Lewis in the questions if you're interested. Jefferson also maintained that Black people lacked imagination and creativity. Twain's rejection of this belief was undoubtedly fueled by his acquaintance with 2 enslaved men, Daniel Quarles and Jerry, and a Black painter in Hartford named Charles Ethan Porter. Daniel Quarles was a gifted storyteller whom Twain had the privilege of listening to every summer evening during his childhood. Throughout his career as a writer, Twain aspired to have the same impact on readers that Daniel Quarles' storytelling had on him. An enslaved man named Jerry introduced Sam Clemens to the possibilities of satire as a tool of social criticism decades before Sam Clemens chose the pen name of Mark Twain. Jerry preached wonderfully insightful and inventive sermons from his master's woodpile for an audience of one, Sam Clemens himself. 50 years later, Twain would write that listening to each satirical tour de force that Jerry came up with had convinced him that he was in the presence of the greatest man in the country. Jefferson had asserted that Black people had no capacity to create painting or any form of art. But Twain had gotten to know a Black painter named Charles Ethan Porter in Hartford and was so impressed that he became a patron and encouraged his friends to buy his work as well. Believing that Porter would benefit from studying art in Paris, Twain helped make it possible for him to go there and assisted his entry into the Paris art world. Jefferson had asserted that Black people did not feel emotions as white people did. But Twain had been exposed to ample examples of Black suffering and grief that disabused him of this idea as well. Mary Ann Cord, the cook at the farm where Twain and his family spent summers, told the moving story of being separated from her last child on the auction block and reunited with him after the war, a story that was so powerful it inspired Twain's first contribution to the Atlantic Monthly. Twain was also familiar with the pain and grief conveyed in the many slave narratives that he read. In short, at a time when the reigning racial ideology of the day maintained that Blacks were mentally inferior, Mark Twain personally knew a number of very smart and gifted individuals who undermined myths about Black mental capacity that pervaded his world. At a time when the leading encyclopedia denied that Black people felt pain the way white people did, Twain's hearing Marianne Court's eloquent descriptions of her grief at being separated from her children stood as a powerful antidote. At a time when the culture largely dismissed Black creativity as inconsequential, Twain's personal memories of Daniel Quarles' unmatched storytelling, Jerry's impressive satirical riffs, and Charles Porter's stellar paintings acted as a counterweight. It's important to note that while Twain had good reason to recognize these myths for what they are, Huck, the narrator of the novel, does not. Huck, the character, unlike Twain, the writer, buys into each of these myths and stereotypes about Black people, as Twain himself did when he was a child. Only over the course of the book does Huck learn to question some of them. Since Huck is the narrator of the book that bears his name, readers see Jim only through his eyes. But while Huck buys into these myths, Twain does not. At least one insightful critic recognized this when the book came out. A reviewer in the San Francisco Chronicle in 1885 noted that, quote, running all through the book is the sharpest satire of the antebellum estimate of the slave, end quote. Alas, the Chronicle writer's savvy understanding of the book was an outlier. Most, but not all, reviewers over the century after the novel came out and beyond confused the book's narrator, the perspective of the book's narrator, with that of the author. And most critics failed to appreciate that Twain was trying to undermine these racist assumptions rather than embrace them. The individuals I've described blasted to smithereens for Twain all of these myths. So why would Twain use a form of popular entertainment shot through with nostalgia for the slave South as a key source for a book that mounted a devastating critique of that world? The racial counterfeit that was the minstrel show, with its premise of Black stupidity, its nostalgia for the world of slavery, and speech as exaggerated and broad as its over-the-top costumes and makeup, was not the key source for Jim that many have claimed it was. Seeing Jim as a figure descended from the stereotypical flat, passive, fatuous stage Negro of the minstrel show requires that we overlook the many occasions when he demonstrates knowledge, skill, agency, empathy, intellect, and understanding, as well as an awareness of the extent to which he can openly show these qualities to white people. As I show in my new book, every example cited to demonstrate that Jim embodies stereotypes drawn from minstrelsy may alternatively be seen to highlight Jim's perceptive strategies for self-preservation and self-empowerment. Let me give just 3 such examples. Take the scene in which we meet Jim in chapter 2, and I assume all of you have read the book, yes? Yes, okay. One night, Huck and Tom decide to steal a couple of candles. You'll remember this from the widow's kitchen. They find Jim sitting outside the tree, some trees near the kitchen door, and they don't answer when he asks who's there and are sure that he hasn't spotted them. When he starts to snore, they assume he's asleep. They sneak by, steal the candles, and leave a nickel on the kitchen table to pay for them. Then Tom decides to play a prank on Jim by hanging his hat from a tree. Well, the boys leave, and Jim palms the nickel. Afterwards, Jim tells a wild, over-the-top story claiming that witches had bewitched him, put him into a trance, ridden him all over the state before setting him down under the trees again and hanging his hat on a limb to show who was behind it. And as Huck tells us, the next time Jim told it, quote, he said they rode him down to New Orleans, and after that, every time he told it, he spread it out more and more till by the end, he said they rode him all over the world and tired him most to death, end quote. Jim hung the 5-cent piece around his neck and claimed that it was the charm that the devil had given him with his own hands. Slaves would come from all over and give Jim gifts just to get a glimpse of that charm and to hear him tell the story of how he got it. Chadwick Hansen wrote in 1963 that, quote, the Jim of this first episode is a recognizable type character, the comic stage Negro, a type who has trod the less reputable boards of the American theater from its beginnings. His ignorance protects him from the mental pain of humiliation. We are free to laugh at him because his ignorance is so subhuman that he cannot feel mental pain. In a similar vein, Frederick Woodard and Donna Ray McCann wrote in 1985 that, quote, the swaggering buffoonery of the minstrel clown is represented early in the novel when Jim awakes to find his hat in a tree, one of Tom's tricks, and then concocts a tale about witches and the devil. Jim and the other slaves have the superstition-steeped minds that give the whole scene a minstrel flavor, end quote. But we get a very different reading of this scene and from a number of scholars, including Ralph Wiley. Ralph Wiley's reading comes across in a remarkable blend of criticism and creative writing. His 1997 screenplay entitled Spike Lee's Huckleberry Finn. Wiley, a brilliant Black satirist and sports writer who co-authored all of Spike Lee's books with him, wrote this screenplay in the hopes of persuading his friend Lee to produce it and his friend Denzel Washington to star in it. The film was never made, although Lee did consider the project seriously and spent a day in his studio in New York discussing it with Wiley and me. Wiley allowed me to publish scenes from the screenplay for classroom use, and these scenes have been performed in American classrooms now for more than 2 decades. I reproduced them in the book, by the way, and they're also available online. In his screenplay, Huck tells the story as he does in the book, and the voiceover narrator speaks Huck's words, but the camera shows us the scene as Jim sees it. In this first scene with Jim in Wiley's screenplay, as in the novel, the boys fail to be quiet as they sneak up on Jim. Quote, "I fell over a root and made noise," Huck tells us. Wiley notes in the stage direction that only a fool would not have seen the boys, so Jim pretends to be one. What would we do if we heard a noise in the dark that we couldn't identify? Well, most of us would just keep listening till we heard it again, right? Well, we wouldn't announce, "I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to sit here and listen till I hear it again." Well, the latter behavior, announcing that you're going to listen, is the kind of thing you'd say to humored children who think they've managed to hide from you when you know perfectly well where they are. Wiley assumes that Jim is not asleep, that he is aware of what's going on around him. Why else would Twain have Huck tell us that, quote, "I fell over a root and made a noise," as he's sneaking up on Jim? Or why the next moment would he have Huck struggle with not being able to scratch an itch and tell us about it? Quote, "Seemed like I'd die if I couldn't scratch," Huck says. The boys are making a racket, and Jim has heard them. Rather than being the gullible victim of a hoax, he's an adult who has let some children think they've fooled him in order to make them happy. After the boys leave, Jim retrieves his hat from the branch where Tom left it and is glad to claim the nickel that Tom left for the candles. But now he has a problem. How does he account for that nickel? He comes up with a wild, over-the-top tale of being ridden by witches and having seen the devil. The story he tells over and over for the delight of his audiences makes him most ruined for a servant. Noting that the incident has often been interpreted as an example of risible Negro gullibility and ignorance, as exemplified by blackface minstrelsy, David Lionel Smith finds instead that Jim has cleverly exploited the conventions of Negro superstition in order to turn a silly boy's prank into his advantage. To his own advantage. He does so by exercising remarkable skills as a rhetorician. Smith writes, by constructing a fictitious narrative of his own experience, Jim elevates himself above his station in life. By becoming, in effect, an author, Jim writes himself a new destiny. It is intelligence, not stupidity, that facilitates Jim's triumph, end quote. Like Wiley, Robert Paul Lamb believes that Jim was only pretending to be asleep. Huck, on the other hand, quote, assumes that Jim fell for the prank, which he clearly did not, and that Jim's story reveals him as gullible, superstitious, dishonest, and lazy, traits in keeping with the dominant stereotypes. Huck does not see Jim's creative achievement for what it is, much as he has trouble seeing Jim for who he really is. A number of critics have had the same problem. Or take another scene often viewed as redolent of minstrelsy, the scene where Huck and Jim discuss King Solomon. Woodard and McCann refer to this exchange as minstrel-like repartee, but Neil Schmitz observes that, quote, Jim has instinctively recognized in Solomon the figure of the slaveholder, the white Southerner who regards the Negro as chattel. He speaks from the depths of his own experience about the child or two that weren't no consequence to Solomon, recalling his own children and all the Black families dismembered on the block, end quote. Carl White suggests that implicitly this challenge, quote, signals a threat to the Southern system of slavery by a man who dares, as did Frederick Douglass, to think for himself, end quote. Indeed, Frederick Douglass himself heard Twain give a reading of the Solomon Dialogue in the Congressional Church in Washington, D.C. on November 24th, 1885, and came backstage to say hello and chat afterwards. Would Douglass, who deplored minstrel shows and all they stood for, have embraced Twain's performance with the enthusiasm he did if the key number in it involving Jim had struck him as redolent of a minstrel show? There is humor in this section, to be sure, as there is in most of the book, but it is not humor at Jim's expense. Jim's reasoning and the intensity of his emotional response to the story are both compelling and understandable. Jim is unlettered and ignorant, but he is still smart, and his unexpected response to Huck's tale of Solomon's so-called wisdom makes us like and respect him, not ridicule him. Or take the scene in chapter 5 where Huck and Jim become separated in the fog. Jim falls asleep on the raft in despair and believes Huck's disappearance means he's died. When Jim wakes after the fog and sees Huck next to him, he's overjoyed. But Huck, as you recall, plays a practical joke on him and insists that he must have been dreaming the whole thing, no fog. After trying without success to get Huck to admit he's lying about the dream, Jim pretends to interpret the alleged dream as Huck seems to want him to. But when Huck points to the trash that's washed up on the raft during what was clearly an actual storm, Jim rebukes him sternly, leading Huck to apologize. Like many critics, Betty Jones sees the gullible and trusting Jim of chapter 15 as a sadly comic victim who is completely fooled by Huck's prank, adding that if Jim may appear momentarily wise in this scene when he chides Huck, that it comes off as an accident because he is simultaneously the head-scratching darky, end quote. But is Jim fooled by Huck's prank? Ralph Wiley thinks not. When Huck doesn't budge from his story and insists that it was all a dream, Wiley believes that Jim, frustrated by Huck's refusal to admit the truth, decides to give him what he's asking for, a clownish, over-the-top, stereotypical performance. In Wiley's screenplay, the stage directions tell Jim to affect a stronger dialect at this point, hamming it up as he pretends to be the easily manipulated dupe that Huck wants him to be. The idea is not Wiley's invention. It is Twain's. Twain has Jim call Huck boss, a name he hasn't used before, but that would be at home in a minstrel show. Well, looky here, boss, Huck says. Looky here, what Jim says, sorry. Jim calls Huck boss twice in this scene, but nowhere else in the book. In Wiley's view, Jim behaves in this scene as any parent would who wants to lead a child to admit that he's lying. He carefully reconstructs what happened during the night, step by step, giving Huck the chance many times to own up to his lie. But Huck refuses to do so. The child needed to be taught a lesson, but he was a white child. And after all, it wasn't clear how Jim might go about doing that. In Wiley's screenplay, as in the novel, Jim's response to Huck's refusal to admit that he's lying, that he's tried to play a trick on him, is to pause and then start affecting a slightly stronger dialect. And in the screenplay, as in the novel, when Huck drops the deceit and points to the trash on the raft, Jim drops the heavier dialect and calmly, clearly chastises Huck sharply for having toyed with his emotions. The combination of Jim's having affected a heavier dialect to play the fool that Huck wants to make of him, and his thinking in silence for 5 minutes before he castigates Huck, conveys how self-aware and perceptive Jim actually is during this scene. Wiley, to his credit, shows Jim in this scene acting as the father of an adolescent boy. It may have helped that he himself was the father of an adolescent boy at the time he wrote this. He sees Jim as a parent giving Huck the tutelage he desperately needs but never had. I find his interpretation and his method for conveying it persuasive. There's also a problem when it comes to cultural and literary sources that are supposedly the roots of scenes involving Jim. Portions of the book involving Jim that they claim to be derived from minstrelsy turn out to come from sources including African-American spiritual traditions, the works of William Shakespeare, and a book that Twain's friend William Wright composed in part in Twain's home. Meanwhile, a section involving the white king and duke probably does have its roots in minstrelsy. So while minstrelsy was likely one source that shaped aspects of the book, it was not necessarily the key source for scenes involving Jim. And then finally, there's the problem of Jim's language. As I show in my book, Twain went to great pains to distinguish Jim's speech from what we might call minstrelese, the kind of talk found in minstrel shows. Reading Black dialect makes many readers uncomfortable, bringing with it, as it does, all the racist baggage of minstrelsy and caricature. But Twain did not see it that way. He saw it as part of his effort to convey the reality of a particular Black man's world with nuance and accuracy. While most of Twain's white contemporaries who wrote Black dialect did so for comic purposes, Twain did not. Marianne Cord, as well as other Black speakers he knew, had taught him that Black dialect was as capable as standard English of conveying strong emotions. And he also knew that it was as capable as standard English of conveying important concrete information as well. To prove this point, and also to show off a little, in 1882, Twain wrote his publisher, James Osgood, a letter detailing the kinds of editorial judgments that he was willing to accept in a manuscript that he was sending him. The letter would be unremarkable if not for the fact that Twain wrote it entirely in Black dialect. Osgood would have recognized it as that. Twain crafted Jim's speech with enormous care. At one point, when he was revising the emotionally powerful scene in which Jim expresses his guilt over having hit his deaf daughter, he began to fear that the copy editor might reflexively make Jim's speech a little more stylized and less readable than he wanted it to be. And so in the left-hand margin, he wrote uncharacteristically a note to the copy editor, "This expression shall not be changed." There are dozens of other examples of the pains that Twain took to differentiate Jim's speech from minstrelese. Several scholars have studied in depth the Black English Twain writes in this novel. For example, Lisa Minnick undertook a systematic study of Jim's use of 31 specific features of African-American vernacular English to determine whether Jim's speech reflected Twain's efforts to evoke how real people spoke, using features identified by linguists today, or whether it was shaped by stereotypical representations from popular theater and fiction. In Minnick's view, Twain showed himself to be a sensitive interpreter of the phonology and grammar associated with Black speech. She adds that the evidence that Twain actually uses the depiction of Jim's speech to disparage him is simply not found in the text of this novel. But both Twain and Jim seem to have fallen victim to a phenomenon Holger Kersten has observed, writing about 19th century American literature. Critics assume that the selection of dialect as a literary medium implies derogatory, if not racist, intentions, he wrote. While that assumption may be correct in some cases, it is not remotely relevant here. Whether we focus on the lexicon, grammar, or orthography of Jim's speech, Twain wanted to make sure that Jim most definitely did not sound like someone in a minstrel show. His many corrections in the manuscript, even his instructions in the margins to the copy editor bear this out. The assumption that minstrel shows were the most significant influence shaping Twain's creation of the main Black character in the novel is both facile and misleading. Sterling Brown understood this. In The Negro in American Fiction in 1937, Brown called Jim, quote, "the best example in 19th century fiction of the average Negro slave, and he is completely believable," end quote. And the comment is all the more significant in that Brown, a prominent Black critic and poet, was known for being extremely blunt and unhesitant to confront racists. Some 30 years after Brown wrote these words, they would be echoed by Langston Hughes, who wrote in the Pictorial History of the Negro in America, "The characterization of Jim and Huck Finn is considered one of the best portraits in American fiction of an unlettered slave clinging to the hope of freedom." The inadequacy of the minstrel show paradigm to describe Jim becomes clear when we attend to dimensions of Jim's character that challenge these stereotypes, when we probe alternative cultural, literary, and real-life sources for episodes involving Jim, and when we focus on the care with which Twain differentiated Jim's speech from minstrelese. Critics' obsession with viewing Jim through the lens of minstrel shows reveals their own limitations rather than Twain's. I've had time here today to provide only a brief overview of the many reasons why we should reject attacks on the book from progressives who maintain that Jim has his roots in minstrelsy and is presented in a demeaning way. By the way, one critic who voiced that attack and who comes in for unequivocal condemnation in my book for doing so is me. Like many others, I too misunderstood and misread Jim, making comments I published in the 1990s about his having a diminished voice. I reject that view now and say so clearly in my new book. Let's try this thought experiment. Imagine that Mark Twain saw Jim as intelligent, responsible, quick-thinking, and mature, as someone as smart and resourceful as, say, George Griffin or John Lewis. Now imagine Twain saw Jim as a parent who cared about his children as much as Marianne Cord cared about hers, and was as pained as she was when he was forced to be separated from them. And imagine that Twain saw Jim as a creative storyteller, as talented as Uncle Daniel or Jerry. What would Jim's story look like if we assumed that Mark Twain saw him as smart and resourceful, as a man with intelligence and agency, as a creative storyteller, and as a caring father weighed down with guilt about his own children, who deals with that guilt by protecting two children who are not his own? I suspect it would look a lot like the book Twain actually wrote. While the Jim Twain created is not the buffoon many critics charge him with being, the Jim we meet in many translations of the novel is. The failure on the part of many translators to grasp the book's satiric critique of racism can offer insight into how bigotry, ethnocentrism, and marginalization work around the world. Much as the idea of Black inferiority was embraced by slaveholders in the US, including Thomas Jefferson, to help justify slavery, the idea undergirded the behavior of many European countries with colonies in Africa and the Caribbean. In two early German translations, as Raphael Berteller observes, lines were added mainly to make Jim look simple-minded. In a clear example of racist attribution of stupidity to Jim, Berteller writes, one translator has Jim think that African-American people are not seen at night, and another has him make the self-evident observation that he usually walks with his feet. As Judith Lavoie notes, the book's first French translator in 1886 whitewashed slavery and blunted the novel's critique of racism by adding a line suggesting that slaves didn't desire freedom when they were treated well, and changing other lines to diminish Jim's agency. When translators did not eliminate dialect entirely in the book, the widespread idea of Black inferiority in colonizing nations led many to have Jim speak as a childish language learner rather than a fluent adult. For example, in Swedish, Danish, and Norwegian translations, B.J. Epstein notes, the white characters, quote, speak a standard Swedish, Danish, or Norwegian, while Jim's Swedish, Danish, or Norwegian is not quite standard and not quite a dialect. It is marked as wrong or off, so Jim speaks brokenly rather than in dialect. While white characters had their words standardized, Epstein writes, the speech of Jim and other Black characters was, quote, was translated in a way that suggested they were deficient and intellectually incapable of learning language. Epstein sees echoes of colonialism in this method of portraying the speech of Black characters, quote, where the natives are seen as childlike and less intelligent and as people who need to be taken care of, while the white colonizers are the smart adults with power, end quote. Epstein suggests that, quote, larger racist ideologies in the society at large may have shaped the pattern in Scandinavian translations of having white characters speak standard Scandinavian languages well and Black ones speak brokenly. Bertella notes that after the 1960s, many translators sought a range of non-pejorative creative strategies to convey Jim's speech as different, but not defective. And I'd be happy to discuss some of these during the question period. My forthcoming book gives teachers and students a roadmap for giving Jim and Twain the respect they deserve. Teachers should not teach the novel if they're not prepared to grapple with the history it engages and the irony through which it does so. But teachers who do feel equipped to do both should not be stymied in this effort by challenges from the right or the left. Huckleberry Finn challenges readers to confront uncomfortable truths about racism and societal norms and can engage them in profound discussions of race, morality, and empathy if we let it. At a time when teaching the accurate history of American racism is under attack and when a book that can illuminate that history and do much more is often banned, the issues I've addressed here are more important than ever. Huck Finn evokes, as perhaps only a work of art can evoke, both the boldness of founding the nation on the ideals laid out in the Declaration of Independence and the brazen hypocrisy that allowed those ideals to be violated so fully from the start. It is perhaps unsurprising that the persistence of racism in our world has fostered a myopia that has prevented many, including myself, from recognizing that until now. Thank you very much. I apologize if we went a little over. I'm happy to spend a few minutes taking questions. Okay, happy to respond to your questions.
We just need to get these mics up and running. Elena, or Joanna, sorry. Any questions in the audience? Let me just Your screen?
In that case, if you could repeat the question.
Okay,
From people.
I'll try, sure.
I'll try to shout in English. So we have just, thank you for a really good talk, first of all. We just studied some of the illustrations from the original Mark Twain Parkman edition. And we learned that he okayed the kind of stereotypical deriving from minstrel show stereotypes of Jim. So I was wondering, how do you see these in the context that you just spoke about? How in fact Jim is not derived from minstrel stereotypes?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And, it's hard to tell why Twain was not more sensitive to that. But I think that, he didn't do the illustrations, he did approve them. He did object to one of Kemble's illustrations of Huck. He didn't object to the illustrations of Jim. And I think that it's just, it's an inconsistency, it's a flaw. But I think that the text itself tells us more about what his real view of Jim was. I really admire the illustrations of Barry Mosher, whose illustrations I reproduce in my book. And I wish I'd brought along one of them to show you, because he really shows the kind of Jim that I was talking about here. Twain didn't recognize how offensive they were, but there are a lot of things in the 19th century that Americans didn't recognize as offensive till the late 20th century. But thank you. It's a really good question.
And I think I got the mics to work now, so very excellent. Another question. Michelle?
Is this good? Can you hear me? Thank you so much for this talk. So in my experience teaching at state schools in red states, I've been doing that for 15 years through a combination of Texas, Ohio. Students can accept the facts of slavery, right? They can feel the horror and the awfulness of it all. The problem, and this is where my question for you comes from, they sort of stop short at the idea that history makes claims on us in the present, right? Like that is the hard thing. So a concept like the afterlives of slavery, for me, which just explains reality, is not something that has a lot of traction with them, right? That the prison industrial complex or diminished life circumstances or diminished lifespan as a result of these things. That's the thing that where they fall short in being able to grasp that, which is to me a kind of fundamental concept of time, of space, of history that I just kind of proceed in as this is normal. And that's where they're having a hard time making that jump. And so I guess, and for me, that might also explain not just what you started with, the rejection of critical race theory, but also things like the climate crisis, the election. It's like we're operating with two different conceptions of time, space, history. And so I guess my question is, can teaching the novel help with that larger problem? Or what are your experiences in teaching that can help bridge that fundamental problem as well?
Such a good question. And I think that the novel can help. I mean, I'm not going to say it can help us deal with the climate crisis denials. No, but the basic premise of the novel is that the most admirable character in it has the least respect, the fewest rights, and in fact is just treated as disposable. And that is still a phenomenon, as you rightly mentioned, that is still a part of our society. And so you can look at the statistics in The New Jim Crow, for example, by Alexander, and cite the ways in which society still treats Black lives as lesser. You can look at the statistics of disparities in healthcare and find the ways in which life expectancies and health expectancies are lesser for Black people. And maternal mortality rates are so much higher. But the basic premise that a society can think of itself as a good, upright, civilized society that denies people like Jim the basic rights that white people have is is just not acceptable. And that's a way to make that link. Another link too, and this is a little more challenging, but look, it's looking at the ways in which Black English is treated and the ways in which it is still viewed as a sign of stupidity and lack of intelligence. My colleague John Rickford has an article in a recent issue of Daedalus, which looks at the fact that one of the main witness in the Trayvon Martin trial was not listened to and largely dismissed because she spoke a heavy Black English. And that could have made a very big difference in that trial. So that's a little more complicated to convey. But if you get at the basic moral issue at the center of the book, it's still the basic moral issue in the center of our society, that we pay lip service to an equality which still is not realized. But thank you. And your students are very lucky because you're trying to make these connections is exactly what a good teacher should do. So thank you.
Any other question from the room? Yep, we have one right here.
Hi. There you go. Yeah. Thank you for a really interesting talk. I was wondering, what do you think of Percival Everett's portrayal of Jim in the book James?
Thank you. And actually, it's a very timely question because yesterday that book won the National Book Award. I like James. I found it was a really good novel. It was a good read. It was compelling. And the only thing, aside from, I'm not going to give a spoiler, and I'm not going to reveal the ending, so I'm not going to talk about the main difference from the book. There's a big plot difference between the way his book ends and the way Twain's does. But aside from that, I think that what, unfortunately, Everett himself doesn't seem to recognize, and this comes across in interviews I've heard him give in podcasts, he has referred to Jim as a simpleton, Twain's Jim. He has bought into the idea that Twain presented him as a diminished figure. What I don't think he realizes is that Twain's Jim is precisely motivated by the same factors as his character, James, and is as intelligent as his character, and that they are kindred spirits. They are, they sound different because his Jim is bidialectal and converses with, Voltaire in his dreams, and is literate. But Twain's Jim is just as smart. He just reveals it and shows it to us in different ways. So I think that it's a very interesting commentary on the book. Did you like it? Have you read it?
I did.
Uh-huh.
But I felt like, sorry. Yeah, I kind of agree with you that it feels like to Percival Everett a necessity to defend Jim and to show that he is in fact an intellectual. And you claim that it's not necessary because it's already shown in the book. So I just find that really interesting. That's just a commentary.
Yeah, I mean, one of the efforts to ban the book, I think the Crisis, I think the NAACP magazine Crisis said that, or one of the Black newspapers said that, this showed, Huckleberry Finn shows us in our time of humiliation that slavery is an embarrassment. And yeah, slavery is a real stain on the nation, but it's not something that Black people should be embarrassed by. It's something that white people should be embarrassed by. And, we don't have to have all of our Black characters or even all of our Black heroes be college educated to respect them. And I think Everett sort of feels like you have to have a highly literate, extremely intellectual figure to be able to really respect him. And I think that Twain wants us to respect Jim, even though he's illiterate. But thank you for that.
Any other questions in the room? Clara?
Thank you for your talk. Is it working? Okay, thank you for your talk. And I also think it's interesting that you are, stressing a different kind of Jim. Huck has been a model for so much subsequent American literature and culture. We can start with Hemingway, but we can go on from there also in popular culture. So I was wondering if your version of Jim, the undiminished Jim, also has traces in subsequent American literature and culture, the way that Huck has.
Yes, and that's also a really interesting question too. And I think that we can recognize that most of the great Black writers of the 20th century have been influenced by Huck Finn. And while the assumption may have been on the part of readers that they were responding to Huck, that many of them were also responding to Jim. So I interviewed Ralph Ellison in the early 1990s, and he said that Twain helped many of us find our own voices. And so Twain's success in evoking Jim's voice helped a lot of Black writers find their own voice. Toni Morrison was influenced by him. David Bradley was influenced by him. I mean, he was very important to many, and Langston Hughes, of course. In fact, Langston Hughes said that, when people compare me to Twain, I'm really flattered. So, I mean, just as Frederick Douglass would not have been Twain's friend if he had been, promoting a minstrel kind of version of the American past, Langston Hughes wouldn't be flattered to be compared to Mark Twain if his politics were as retrograde, as some would say. So I think he's had an enormous influence on Black writers, and that's also one of the main reasons why I feel really very pained at the idea that it's taken out of schools, because young Black students as well as white students need to be inspired by this book to claim the American vernacular speech in Black English as their own, and to claim, to claim a place for themselves in this literary tradition, because, he belongs there. He's a very, very important progenitor. He is when you think about it, yes, there were many Black heroes in slave narratives, but when you think about it, they're not written in dialect at all. They're all written in standard English because the enslaved people who wrote them wanted to prove their right to have a seat at the table of culture. But the speech that shaped them, and that shaped all of Black Americans' experience, and that shaped all of American culture, deserves to be credited with its power. That it has to be robbed of the stigma that's often attached to it. Thank you for that.
Hi, thank you so much for this talk. I was struck by a metaphor that you used at the beginning of your talk, where you talked about the novel as a Trojan horse. And I found that very fascinating because it kind of reminds me of the way that we often use literature in the literary classroom, in the sense that, we think, okay, the surface is what there is, but in fact, there's much more to discover inside of the horse, right? But it's also kind of a militaristic metaphor, of course. And I wondered to what extent that novel could also be a friendly invitation in that sense, right? And I'm thinking, of course, of continuing what Michelle mentioned about, I don't know, Trump voters in the classroom, right? How can we use the novel, so that it's really a friendly invitation, right? And to discover something about what we all think we know, right? But that other people might not want to know even, right? And do not want to discover, maybe. So it's kind of
No, that's a wonderful question too. Yeah, I mean, I think that the novel, and actually all of literature, but this novel in particular, because we're talking about it today, is an exercise in empathy and compassion. And I'm afraid that a lot of what we saw in this last election was lack of empathy, and a kind of myopia that did not view many fellow citizens, many people in the country, as human. And we're still suffering from the same kind of redlining of certain races and certain minorities as non-human. And literature can help us overcome that, because it takes us inside their heads, inside their hearts. But it's also, you about the fugu fish, the Japanese delicacy, which is one of the greatest delicacies in the world if it's prepared right, but is toxic if it's not. And I think, Huck Finn is like that too, and maybe literature is like that too, that if it's not taught with care, if you don't prepare students to be able to deal with the issues that it raises, it can be really toxic. but if it's taught right, it can be really powerful. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. I'm Gina Kaysen. I'm at Georgia State. So I teach an institution it's a majority Black student institution, but not an HBCU. So I'd like to ask a question that stems from my teaching because it's just such a different classroom context than other institutions in red states. Where I primarily teach Pudd'nhead Wilson with Charles Chestnut. And so thinking about these other two characters where Twain really turns up the volume on us seeing Roxy's savvy intention through the novel. And I was wondering how much you think that's a response to him, if your argument's correct and it's very convincing that what he's trying to do with Jim isn't recognized by his contemporary readers and reviewers. Roxy, there's never a doubt of her canny, savvy ability. And so how you see the relationship between those two characters, and then later something like Chestnut with Uncle Julius, who also makes it very clear that Julius is in charge of the narrative. And so where you see in kind of this character landscape of the 19th century, how something like maybe the subtlety that doesn't catch on initially with some readers of Huck Finn, maybe we see later response, even in that century of upping the obvious intentionality of the Black characters.
Thank you for that. Again, really, really interesting question. I don't think Twain is aware of the responses or responding to reviewers. I mean, today with digitized newspapers, we can read them. I don't even know that he was aware of the reviews that, or it's not as if people were really engaging with this issue within that span of 10 years. So I don't know that it's shaping Twain's work in the later novel, but I think it's a terrific idea to teach Twain alongside Chestnut and also Dunbar. And in particular, and in some of my classes, I do that. Two of the stories that I love to teach are The Ingrate by Dunbar and The Passing of Grandison by Chestnut, both of which are stories in which slaves feign to be stupid and stereotypical to be able to help their families escape. They both do the act because they know it will get them what they need. And they use the same kind of dialect that Twain uses. They write that they're written a few years later. But it's really important to be able to show students that Black writers were making the same moves. And they were having slaves feign the stereotypes, perform the stereotypes that white people expected of them to be able to reach their goals. So I think that's a great thing to do. Thank you.
Any other question in the room? Anna?
Oh, thank you. Oh. Yeah, thank you for a wonderful talk, Professor Fishkin. I was just wondering if there are no other questions, you could say a bit more about those two people who you mentioned. You could talk more about who inspired John Lewis and George Griffin. Sounds like very colorful characters. So if you can elaborate on that.
Yeah, they're both really fascinating. And in fact, the first photograph of George Griffin was just found a couple of months ago. And if you look at the current issue of the latest issue of the Mark Twain Journal, he's on the cover. George Griffin was this remarkable man who was absolutely charming and who would take the coats of all the political elite of Hartford as they would come to visit Twain, who was the sort of social center of Hartford at the time, and he would engage them in political conversations. And he was so charming, they loved talking to him. And then he would take the information that he gleaned and place bets before elections in the Black community. And he got a large sum of money. He was the wealthiest Black man in Hartford. And he turned out to also be very good at keeping his money after the crash of it was I think it was 1893. Twain went to visit him in New York, where Twain had lost all of his money, and he had to leave his house in Hartford and live in Europe. And he was still friends with George Griffin. He went to visit him in New York, where he was a waiter in the Union League Club. And George Griffin was a banker to all the white patrons of the Union League Club, and he took security as gold watches, only watches. And he had a ton of money while they had lost all of theirs. But he was very, very smart, and he was also fascinating and charming, and he was the favorite of Twain's children. They just thought he was God. He's a really, really interesting figure. He's actually going to be the subject of a book by Kevin McDonnell, who found the photograph. And John Lewis was also a remarkable man. He was, he was literate, but he was, largely unlettered, not educated, although he was literate. And what he figured out, this carriage, a runaway horse was pulling a carriage with a couple of members of Twain's family down a steep hill in Elmira, New York. And they watched aghast because it was going so fast. They were sure that it was going to crash and everyone was going to die. And Lewis figured out this remarkable geometry that if he was pulling a wagon of manure at the time, he was a farmer, and he realized that if he quickly pulled his wagon to a certain angle and jumped out and grabbed the horse's rein, he would make a V that would prevent the crash. And that's what happened. It required both unusual strength and also just figuring that out really quickly. And so he was a lifelong friend of Twain's in upstate New York. And that was really important to him. And he had enormous respect for him. And there are photos of Lewis and Twain that are out there that we can see. So yeah, I mean, they're two of many fascinating figures who really helped shape his sense of Black interiority, Black intelligence, Black strength, and also sort of Mary Ann Cord as well. And Mary Ann Cord's story, which really left a huge impression on Twain, left all more an impression because that son that she was reunited with after the war, unbeknownst to Twain, he had been Twain's barber since he moved to Elmira during summers, and he hadn't known the story of how he was reunited with his mother after the war. So all of these people really helped shape his sense of Black life that helped him reject some of the stereotypes of the culture. Thank you.
So thank you so much for a wonderful talk. I just have again, I'm not a literary scholar, I'm a historian, but I'm just wondering, so you're writing this book and you're making this argument in the polarized state of the United States these days. What is your hope that your argument will come across to a lot of academics?
I'm hoping it will give them courage to teach the book. I have an appendix that's notes for teachers of suggestions of specific things that can help in the classroom. I hope it'll give them the courage to teach the book. I also hope it'll give them the courage to argue against those who want to take the book out of classrooms and libraries. And I also hope it will encourage them to teach the history that's necessary to understand the book. That if you can't teach the history courses, maybe you can teach the literature courses that will get history in through the back door. I mean, it's really sad that actually literally courses are being forbidden. I was just reading today at the University in Florida that courses that mention race in the title are being taken out of the catalog. They're not allowed to be taught. And that's ridiculous. But they can't. Well, I mean, I would say that they can't ban the teaching of literature. Maybe they can. I mean, in Georgia after the Civil War, you probably know this, that there was a law that said you can't teach American history because the North won too many battles. They didn't want that history to be taught. So they literally, I don't remember if the law passed or if it was only proposed. Did it pass?
I think it only was narrowly defeated.
It was narrowly defeated, right. They literally wanted to prevent American history from being taught because recent American history was too embarrassing. So who knows what they can do? But, we have to fight back. And, I think that Twain is a great ally because also he's a reminder that, anti-racism isn't a new stance, that, the greatest canonical, most widely known around the world American author, was engaged in this project. And so you can't be dismissed as, woke when you're just basically celebrating a culture that has had this as an important part of it all along. Thank you. Thank you very much. I want to thank you for really terrific questions. I really enjoyed them. You're a great group.
We have Jan coming up. Hold on.
Yes, well, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation.
You're very welcome. Thank you. My pleasure.
And basically now we are going to, so originally we were going to have the award ceremony now, but we've postponed that until later today. So we'll take the lunch break now, and we'll come back to this auditorium at 12:45 when Professor James Fishkin will be giving his talk, and when we'll have many other things happening. So see you in an hour, a little more than an hour. Sorry about forgetting to tell you about that. The format had changed a little bit, so there's more time than.
Oh, I didn't know.